Hello there everybody, welcome back to iTTV. For today's lesson, let's look at transport in lesson 7. Well, other than not being able to synthesize our own food, what is one other distinct characteristic that makes humans and most animals different from plants? Yes, you're right again. Well, we can move from place to place, but plants just simply cannot. Now for today's lesson, let's look at blood clotting mechanisms and the consequences. The learning outcomes for today's lesson would be to explain the necessity for blood clotting at the site of damaged vessels. Secondly, to explain the mechanism of blood clotting. And thirdly, to predict the consequences of impaired blood clotting in an individual. So for today's lesson, we only have 3 learning outcomes. Now, when we have a cut on our skin, we realize in a short while that there will be blood clot on the wound. Why does our wound get clotted? Is it necessary for blood to clot on our skin? Yes, obviously it's important. So let's look into the necessity of blood clotting. Now, blood clotting is important to prevent serious blood loss from our body. Secondly, it prevents the entry of microorganisms and foreign particles into our body. Thirdly, to avoid decrease of blood pressure to low level, which is important in our blood circulation as we had discussed in our last lesson on blood circulation. Now, let's look at the blood clotting mechanism. How exactly does the mechanism operate? Platelets which are present in blood aids in blood clotting. Once there is a cut on the skin, the blood vessels around the wound become constricted and the wound is quickly covered by platelets. The platelet becomes sticky and clump the wound to decrease the blood loss. Now let's look at the flow chart of the blood clotting mechanism because it's actually more complex and intricate. Okay, so when we accidentally cut our finger, blood flows out of the wound. Blood vessels will then constrict around the wound to decrease loss of blood. And if you can see to the diagram, you notice that the blood vessels will constrict to prevent serious blood loss. Now, platelets in the blood will become exposed to the outside air. And the platelets would release chemicals so that other platelets become sticky and clump together again to avoid blood loss. Platelets and damaged tissues would release clotting factors in a series of reactions. So what are these series of reactions? And this is a point that you have to understand because it can be quite complicated. Now, to aid your understanding, let me move to the board to show you blood clotting mechanism. So the platelets and damaged tissue will release an enzyme known as thrombokinase. Okay, this is released by the platelets, and thrombokinase will actually convert inactive prothrombin to active thrombin. Okay. So this is active and this will be inactive. So as you can see, thrombokinase actually changes the inactive prothrombin into active thrombin, and this happens in the presence of calcium 2+ and something we call factor 7. So as you can see, calcium is needed not only for strong bones and teeth, but is also needed for blood to clot. Now, inactive prothrombin, on the other hand, is actually released by the by the liver. Now, so the liver actually releases inactive prothrombin, and in order for inactive prothrombin to be released by liver, this process needs vitamin K. As you recall, vitamin K is needed for blood clotting. And active thrombin is needed because active thrombin will be there to convert the plasma protein. It is fibrinogen into fibrin. Now, fibrin is needed because they will form fibrin threads to just lock in the blood and allow the blood to clot. So, in summary, as you notice, the liver produces inactive prothrombin, and this process requires vitamin K. Inactive prothrombin will only be converted to active thrombin in the presence of an enzyme that we call thrombokinase. And thrombokinase is released by the platelets in the presence of calcium ions and factor 7, which are just some clotting factors. And why do we need thrombin? Because thrombin is needed to change the plasma protein. It is fibrinogen into something we call fibrin. And fibrin threads are very important to form part of the scab to clot the blood. So this is the series of the clotting factors and how they play such an important role to clot blood. Let's look at the slide to have a better understanding of how these clotting factors work. So, thrombokinase is released in the presence of clotting factor 7 and calcium, and thrombokinase converts inactive prothrombin into active thrombin. On the other hand, prothrombin is produced in the liver with the presence of vitamin K. Thrombin then converts plasma protein and fibrinogen into insoluble fibrin fibers, which form a protective layer consisting of a meshwork of fiber threads. As you can see in the diagram, the last part of the diagram, that there is a cornified layer known as the scab. Platelets and red blood cells become trapped in the fibers during the blood, resulting in a blood clot. And the top layer of cells eventually die, becoming corn-filled, so forming the scab. Below the scab, new cells are being formed and the scab drops off. So you can see in the lowest part of the diagram, the scab is formed. But below the scab, there are new and active cells dividing to actually regenerate the part of the skin that was cut. So, let us look at the blood clotting mechanism in summary. And this flowchart shows the whole summary of the blood clotting mechanism. When we accidentally cut our finger, blood flows out of the wound. And that will be dangerous. It might lead to serious blood loss. But blood vessels very quickly will constrict around the wound to decrease the loss of blood. Platelets in the blood become exposed to the outside air, and then they break down to release chemicals so that other platelets become sticky and clump together to avoid blood loss. Platelets and damaged tissues release clotting factors in a series of reactions. So as mentioned on board just now, thrombokinase is released, right, in the presence of factor 7 and calcium ions. Thrombokinase is an enzyme that converts inactive prothrombin into active thrombin. And as you know, inactive prothrombin is produced in the liver in the presence of vitamin K. That's why we all know vitamin K is needed for blood clotting. Thrombin then converts fibrinogen into insoluble fibrin fibers, which forms a protective layer consisting of a meshwork of fiber threads, and blood is clotted. So I hope that you had a better understanding of the whole summary of what happens when the finger is cut or basically a wound is produced. That it's really marvelous how our blood clotting mechanism actually works so synergistically together, and even below the scab there are new cells which are actively being formed, and the scab will eventually drop off. Let's look at other types of conditions caused by perhaps errors or an impaired blood clotting mechanism. What are the consequences? So now let's look at the consequences of an impaired blood clotting mechanism. As you know, blood clotting is good because it helps us to avoid serious blood loss. At the same time, we also have heparin being produced in the liver to avoid blood, to clot itself in undamaged blood vessels, because if the blood vessel is not damaged and blood clots within the blood vessel, this causes thrombosis, and that's not good for our body. But there are times there are problems when blood clotting never happens for certain individuals, and clotting happens at places where it's not required to. So we look at the first consequence of an impaired blood clotting mechanism, which would be hemophilia. It is a genetic disease caused by single recessive gene on the X chromosome. The individual has a defected gene will be unable to produce certain clotting factors, such as factor 7. And this is an impaired clotting mechanism because the individual cannot produce clotting factors and will face excessive bleeding if there is a cut. But now there are developments through genetic engineering that promotes production of factor 7 for treatment of hemophilia. Well, it would be sad if a person who is hemophilic actually just has a small cut, but because all these blood clotting mechanisms don't come into place, so the blood will just keep flowing, and this could lead to potentially serious blood loss. For us which do not have this genetic disorder, even with a single small cut, there would be the blood clotting mechanism in place. But for hemophilics, thankfully that there is genetic engineering now, which will actually promote the production of factor 7. Now let's look at the second consequence of an impaired blood clotting mechanism: thrombosis. Now, thrombosis, on the other hand, is a blood clot, which is known as a thrombus, that is formed within the blood circulation, which is on the damaged rough inner artery. This results in thrombosis, a condition where the artery is blocked. So if you refer to the diagram, a thrombus is a blood clot that is formed within the artery. And of course, this will block blood flow. And as you can see in the diagram, this shows an example of how thrombus happens and results in thrombosis. And when thrombosis happens in the heart, this causes a person to have heart attack, or known as myocardial infarction. Now, embolism is a condition when the thrombus is displaced and flows through the blood circulation. So this embolus can be trapped in small arteries and it blocks the flow of blood. So embolism is just a thrombus which actually detaches from the original place where it is formed, and it flows through the blood circulation, and it can easily be trapped in any small artery, hence blocking the flow of blood. So we could have consequences like myocardial infarction, whereby chest pain is caused when a coronary artery is blocked. So what happens is that if the embolus actually travels to a coronary artery, blocking blood flow, this could result in angina, which is known as chest pain. The blockage actually causes death of some of the muscle cells of the heart. because lack of oxygen supply brings to a condition known as myocardial infarction or known as the heart attack. So as you can see, patients can recover if only a small area of the muscle cell dies. But in some cases, patient can die if most of the muscle cells are dead. So as you can see in the diagram, a big portion of the muscle cells are dead, and thereby the person could actually die of a heart attack, which is known as myocardial infarction. Now, let us look at another condition known as stroke. Stroke happens when the blockage of blood happens to the brain cells. And stroke is caused by the presence of an embolus which blocks the flow of blood to the brain. So now this time, the embolus actually has flowed to the artery of the brain. Hence, it blocks the flow of blood to the brain cells. And the brain is a very sensitive organ which is very sensitive to insufficient oxygen. Even insufficient oxygen for a few minutes can lead to serious life consequences. So, if you look at the picture, there is an embolus in one of the arteries supplying blood to the brain. Now, that was for the theory part. Let us look at some questions. Now, firstly, once there is a cut on the skin, the blood vessels dash. A. Release chemicals to avoid blood loss. B. Become constricted to avoid blood loss. C. Clump together to avoid blood loss. And D. Form a scab to avoid blood loss. Now, what do you think is the answer for this very simple question? Yes, you're right, because if you recall, once there is a cut on the skin, the blood vessels will automatically become constricted to avoid blood loss. So the answer is B. Now, question 2. Now, which of this is true? A. Fibrinogen form meshwork of threads around the wound. B. Thrombokinase converts thrombin into prothrombin. C. Prothrombin requires vitamin K in order to be produced in the liver. D. Blood vessels release clotting factors. So do take some time to think of the answer for this question. Now, if you try to recall the theory part, now A. Was it fibrinogen which formed a meshwork of threads around the wound? I would think certainly not, right? The answer would be fibrin, active fibrin, not fibrinogen. Now, so option A is wrong. Option B, thrombokinase converts thrombin. It's not thrombin. It's converting prothrombin into thrombin. So B is wrong. C, prothrombin needs vitamin K in order to be produced in the liver. That's certainly true because I just wrote on the board that prothrombin needs vitamin K in order to be produced in the liver. So the answer is option C. Now, let's look at another question. Substance X is important in order to convert fibrinogen into fibrin. So what is substance X? A. Thrombin, B. Thrombokinase, C. Platelets, and D is calcium. So do think carefully, boys and girls. Do not be tricked by this answer, by this question. Yes. Now, not all substances are enzymes because some students would very quickly think that the answer is B because B is an enzyme. But for this particular blood clotting mechanism, the conversion of fibrinogen into fibrin is only done by active thrombin. So the answer is option A. Thrombokinase was needed to convert from prothrombin to thrombin. And certainly the answer is not B, C, or D. Now let us look at another question. What is the similarities between thrombosis and embolism? A. Both involve the formation of thrombus in the blood circulation. B. Both involve formation of embolus in the blood circulation. C. Both causes excessive bleeding in an individual. And D. Both is a hereditary disease caused by X chromosome. Now please carefully read through the answer and think of the answer for this question. Now, as you can see, thrombosis and embolism both involve formation of a thrombus. Now, thrombus will be like a blood clot, and it's not formation of embolus as suggested in option B, because embolus is a thrombus which is formed and is displaced and flows in the blood circulation. So, the answer in A and B might look close and might both be pretty accurate, but actually the answer is only option A, which is the formation of a blood clot, which is known as a thrombus in the blood circulation. Thrombosis and embolism, they might lead to heart attacks and stroke depending on where the embolism actually happens. Now, let us look at another question. Which of these statements are false? Stroke is caused by presence of embolus, which blocks the flow of blood to brain. B. Embolus is conditioned when the thrombus is displaced and flows through blood circulation. C. Angina is caused when coronary artery is blocked. D. Myocardial infarction is a genetic disease caused by a single recessive gene on X chromosome. Now this question is actually pretty simple. I'm sure some of you would have already gotten the answer. Yes? Now, looking at option A, is stroke caused by an embolus which blocks the flow of blood to brain? Certainly so, because myocardial infarction is caused by presence of embolus which blocks the flow of blood to the heart muscles. B. Embolus is a condition when the thrombus is displaced and flows through blood circulation. This is certainly definitely true. C. Angina, which is chest pain, is caused when the coronary artery is blocked. Coronary is to do with the heart. Definitely true. So this leaves only the answer to option D. Myocardial infarction is definitely not a genetic disease, but it's caused by certain lifestyle factors. It's caused by when a thrombus is displaced and flows through the blood circulation and blocks the coronary artery. So the answer is option D. Now, let's look at another question. Which of these are necessary for blood clotting? Number 1, prevent entry of microorganisms. Number 2, maintains blood pressure. Number 3, prevents entry of worms. Number 4, maintains flow of lymph. So looking at all the options A, B, C, D, boys and girls, what do you think are the answers? Well, yes, you're right. The answer is option A, 1 and 2, to prevent the entry of microorganisms, and part 2, to maintain blood pressure, because if there is no blood clot, a lot of blood will be lost, thus reducing the blood pressure. Certainly, blood clotting doesn't prevent entry of worms, alright, or to maintain flow of lymph. Now, let us look at another question. Which of these never aids blood clotting? A. Clotting factor. B. Platelets. C. Thrombokinase. And D. Heparin. What do you think? Now, of course, we know clotting factors like factor 7, thrombokinase, they're all very important. Platelets are the ones that release thrombokinase. So they're really very important. Now, so the only answer for this is heparin. Heparin is there to prevent blood from clotting in undamaged blood vessels. Heparin is also produced in the liver, just like prothrombin. But heparin doesn't aid in blood clotting. It prevents blood clotting. Now, let's move on to a very interesting question. What is the cause of myocardial infarction? What do you think? Just slowly think about what you're going to write, in the exams. Now, myocardial infarction is a blockage of coronary artery by thrombus, causing death of some of the muscle cells of the heart because lack of oxygen supplied and also lack of nutrients are being supplied to the heart muscles. If a small part of the heart muscle dies, it's okay, the person still can be saved. But if a large portion of the heart muscle dies, then that person might actually die from a heart attack. So in certain cases like this, the sooner emergency help is given to a person which is suffering from this myocardial infarction, the higher the chances of the person to survive from this heart attack. Let's look at this question. Why is blood clotting important in human body? As we know, blood clotting prevents serious blood loss from our body, and it prevents the entry of microorganisms and foreign particles into our body. Blood pressure is important to be maintained at about 120/80 mm mercury for the blood circulation, so blood clotting prevents in falling of blood pressure to too low levels. Because if our blood pressure falls to such low levels, there will be some vital organs that will receive insufficient blood supply, for example, the heart or the brain. Now let us look at the last question. Explain the blood clotting mechanism. Now this question could possibly come out in an essay exam question. So it's really important for you to memorize the whole mechanism of blood clotting. And it's good to draw flow charts to help in your understanding. What do you think are the answers? So, you could start off your answer by saying, when we accidentally cut our finger, blood flows out of the wound. Immediately blood vessels will constrict around the wound to decrease blood loss. Platelets in the blood that become exposed to the air, they break down and they release chemicals so that the platelets would become sticky and come together to prevent blood loss. Platelets in damaged tissues, they start releasing clotting factors in a series of reactions. What are these series of reactions? Well, platelets produce thrombokinase, which is an enzyme that converts inactive prothrombin into active thrombin. On the other hand, prothrombin is produced in the liver in the presence of vitamin K. Thrombin then converts fibrinogen into insoluble fibrin fibers, which forms a protective layer consisting of a meshwork of fiber threads. Platelets and red blood cells become trapped in the fibers, resulting in a blood clot. As we know, the top layer of cells eventually die, so forming the scab. Below the scab, new cells have been formed, and eventually the scab will drop off. So that would be the mechanism of how blood clotting actually works. So with that, we end our lesson for today. Thank you so much for watching iTTV. I hope you had a better understanding on the blood clotting mechanism and consequences of impaired blood clotting. So we look forward to see you the next time, and thank you so much once again, and may you have a great week ahead. Thank you.